unexpectedly interrupted. Just after sunrise, a tourist set out early to enjoy a peaceful hike along a temple trail. As he walked through the lush greenery, something unusual caught his eye: a pale shape partially hidden among the trees. At first, he assumed it was a piece of clothing or a forgotten item left behind. But as he got closer, a sense of unease set in. Realizing the seriousness of what he had found, he quickly contacted local authorities. Emergency responders arrived promptly, and with the help of identification documents and hotel records, they were able to confirm the woman's identity. Her name was Miriam Bielta. Miriam Bielta was born on November 29, 1992, in the historic town of Hildesheim, located in Lower Saxony, Germany. Raised in a loving, supportive home, she grew up surrounded by encouragement, curiosity, and a deep respect for learning. Her parents instilled in her a strong moral compass, and her natural empathy made her a trusted friend to many. That balance of compassion and intellect became a defining part of who she was. By the time she reached adulthood, Miriam had already developed into a driven and accomplished young woman. She pursued engineering at one of Germany's top universities, where she quickly earned the admiration of her professors and peers. Known for her sharp, analytical thinking and calm, measured approach to challenges, she thrived in an academic environment that demanded both precision and creativity. But Miriam wasn't just focused on books and lectures. Outside the classroom, she explored a wide range of passions: photography, hiking, and volunteering for environmental causes. Nature was her refuge. Whether she was hiking through forests, capturing landscapes on camera, or working on community cleanup projects, she felt most at peace when surrounded by the beauty of the natural world. Those close to her often said that she lived with intention. She believed in making the most out of every experience, big or small. Travel, in particular, was one of her greatest joys, not just as a way to unwind, but as a way to connect with different cultures, broaden her perspective, and deepen her understanding of the world. So in early 2019, it came as no surprise to those who knew her when she began planning a trip to Thailand. It was a destination that seemed to capture everything she loved: lush landscapes, rich cultural heritage, and a spirit of adventure. For Miriam, this trip wasn't just about taking a break. It was an opportunity to merge her love for travel with personal reflection and exploration. She had often extended her work trips to soak in the local atmosphere, and Thailand was no different. This time, she looked forward to experiencing its beauty firsthand. Her itinerary was carefully crafted. After a series of meetings with suppliers in Bangkok, meetings her colleagues later confirmed had gone exceptionally well, Miriam decided to take a short detour. She planned to visit Pattaya, and then the lesser-known but serene island of Koh Sichang. It was the kind of location that offered solitude and scenic beauty, a stark contrast to the bustling urban centers she had just left behind. By mid-March, she had arrived on the island. Nestled among the cliffs and sea breezes, Sichang offered a slower pace of life, the kind Miriam found deeply soothing. Her hotel, a modest but charming guest house not far from the beach, became her base. The staff remembered her as polite and thoughtful, someone who seemed to be deeply engaged with the place rather than merely passing through. On one of her final days on the island, Miriam planned to visit an old temple perched high on a hill, an ancient site known for its spiritual energy and panoramic views. Accessible only by a winding stairway hidden behind lush vegetation, the temple was rarely crowded, appealing primarily to those who sought reflection and solitude. Miriam, always respectful of local traditions, had read about the temple in a travel forum and made it one of the highlights of her trip. That morning, everything appeared normal. Locals observed her leaving her guest house with a small backpack, a bottle of water, and her camera. She smiled at the vendor arranging flowers near the foot of the temple stairs and parked her rented motorbike nearby. Surveillance footage later confirmed she had ascended the steps alone, moving with quiet confidence and a calm, thoughtful demeanor. The flower vendor recalled her pausing briefly to admire a jasmine bouquet before heading upward. But as the day wore on, things took an unexpected turn. The motorbike remained parked in the same spot by sunset. The vendor, who had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the island's visitors, noticed this first. He hadn't seen Miriam return from the hill, and that absence began to weigh heavily on his mind. By morning, her belongings were still untouched. The realization that something was wrong began to ripple through the community. Hotel staff attempted to reach her by phone, but calls went unanswered. Messages were left. Her absence was eventually reported to local authorities. When investigators began retracing the last known steps of Miriam Bielta, it quickly became clear that her presence on Sichang Island was never intended to be an extended stay. In fact, her itinerary revealed something far more routine and structured. A brief excursion, just 1 day in duration. She had planned it down to the hour. Arrive in the morning, visit a scenic hilltop temple, capture a few photos, enjoy a peaceful lunch overlooking the sea, and then return to the mainland by evening. It was the kind of plan that reflected Miriam's personality in every detail. Precise, intentional, and cautious. Those who knew her well weren't surprised by the structure of her schedule. Miriam was known to be a highly organized individual. She wasn't one to take spontaneous risks, especially in unfamiliar places. She avoided interactions with strangers unless absolutely necessary, kept her belongings close and secure, and made a point of checking in regularly with family back home. It wasn't simply a habit. It was part of how she made travel feel safe and fulfilling. So when her messages stopped arriving on April 7th, it was more than just a lapse in communication. It was a warning sign. By midday, she was no longer responding to messages. By evening, the silence was complete. Her family, accustomed to receiving updates from her during trips, began to grow worried. What began as mild concern quickly escalated into alarm. It wasn't like Miriam to go off the grid, even for a few hours. That night, uncertainty took root. By the following morning, with no new messages and no check-ins, her loved ones contacted both the German embassy and the local authorities in Thailand, reporting her as missing. Back on the island, the police were already reviewing surveillance footage obtained from the temple trail and the area surrounding the hill. The video showed Miriam climbing the steps toward the temple just as the morning sun began filtering through the trees. She walked steadily, a bottle of water in one hand and a small backpack over her shoulder. Her expression was peaceful. She even smiled briefly at something off-camera, perhaps a passing bird or a scenic view. That image, still and silent, would become the final confirmed moment of her presence on the island. It was only after authorities began speaking to local residents and shopkeepers that a new detail emerged, one that added a layer of mystery to the already troubling situation. A few days before she disappeared, Miriam had been seen sitting at a small cafe near the main pier. She was not alone. Witnesses remembered her speaking with a man, someone not known to them, and notably not a fellow traveler staying in the usual hotels. While no one could definitively identify him, those who saw the interaction described it as casual but familiar, as though they'd met before. Whether he was someone she had encountered during her travels or perhaps connected to her through her work remained unclear. After that meeting, however, no one reported seeing them together again. The man never checked into any hotel nearby, nor did he appear on ferry logs as a regular visitor. Still, the memory of that coffee shop conversation lingered as a curious and potentially significant clue. Then came April 8th. Just after sunrise, the peaceful calm of the island was disrupted. A Thai tourist had risen early to hike the temple trail, hoping to enjoy the morning's cool air and the soft light through the trees. As he ascended the stone steps, winding through dense foliage, he noticed something odd in the undergrowth just off the path. Amid the rich green of the jungle, something pale and unmoving drew his attention. At first, he thought it might be a discarded piece of clothing or perhaps a forgotten item left by another hiker. But as he stepped closer, the shape became more unsettling. Clearly not part of the natural surroundings. Disturbed by the scene, the tourist immediately contacted local emergency services. Within an hour, police and rescue teams had begun ascending the hill, the mood shifting from routine concern to focused urgency. News spread quickly across the island, and by late morning, a growing number of residents had gathered near the trail's entrance, anxious to understand what was unfolding. Simultaneously, more than 9,000 kilometers away in Germany, Miriam's family was facing a rising tide of dread. When the call came confirming that a woman matching her description had been found near the temple, hope gave way to heartache. Authorities worked swiftly to confirm her identity. Based on travel documents, personal effects, and reports from the hotel, the woman was soon identified as Miriam Bielta, the 26-year-old tourist whose absence had triggered the search. At first, local authorities considered the possibility that her death had been the result of an accident. Perhaps a slip on the uneven, sometimes damp trail. The terrain was known to be tricky in places, especially during the early morning hours when dew could make the stone surfaces slick. But upon further inspection of the scene, and after analyzing the footage, that theory began to unravel. Investigators focused their attention on surveillance footage captured at the trailhead and surrounding facilities. In one clip, just minutes after Miriam had disappeared from view, another figure appeared. A man dressed in dark clothing, who seemed to be walking the same path at a cautious pace. He maintained a distance, but his presence was unmistakable. He was not someone police had previously identified in connection with Miriam. The same camera later captured his return. His clothes appeared damp and dirtied, with noticeable light smudges across his trousers and sleeves. He glanced around frequently, his movements anxious and hurried. Police soon returned to the flower vendor stationed at the base of the hill. He too remembered the man. At first, he hadn't thought much of it. Tourists came and went often, and solo travelers were not uncommon. But upon closer questioning, he described the man's behavior in more detail. When asked if he had seen anything unusual, the vendor recalled how the man had returned down the trail appearing unsettled. When casually asked if everything was all right, the man replied with a shrug, claiming he had slipped and gotten a bit muddy. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and a key detail from a local flower vendor all came together to reveal the first significant lead in what was becoming one of the most disturbing cases on Sichang Island in recent memory. A license plate number, captured on camera near the Temple Trail's entrance, was traced back to a motorbike frequently parked near the island's western edge. It belonged to a man named Ranakorn Romruan, a 24-year-old local who, until that moment, had existed mostly on the periphery of the community's attention. Authorities acted swiftly. Officers arrived at Ranakorn's modest home, nestled at the edge of a wooded path, hoping to locate him and begin asking questions about his presence near the scene. But he was not there. His home was locked, quiet. The motorbike was absent. Investigators fanned out across the area, trying to track him down. Something about the sequence of events, the proximity, the timeline, the footage, suggested he might not just be a bystander in this case. They needed answers, and they needed them quickly. As law enforcement delved deeper, a clearer picture of Ranakorn began to form. To the casual observer, he had always been something of a loner, reserved, quiet, often keeping to himself. But beneath that quiet surface, neighbors hinted at something more troubling. Some described his behavior as distant, even slightly unnerving. He rarely made eye contact, avoided social interactions, and spent long hours riding his motorbike through the island's lesser-traveled roads. Others mentioned seeing him pacing alone on the beach at dusk, muttering to himself or staring into the distance as if lost in thought. Few people had ever tried to get close to him, and those who had recalled moments of unpredictable behavior, sharp mood swings, outbursts of frustration, and a tendency to become overwhelmed by social cues. He wasn't violent, they said, but something about his presence had always made people uneasy. So who was this man, and how had his path crossed so tragically with that of Miriam Bilte, a visitor from across the world, simply looking to explore a new place and enjoy a peaceful day? Investigators would later piece together the events of April 7, 2019, with the help of timelines, camera footage, and eventually, Ranakorn's own words. In the early morning hours, while the island remained hushed under the gray-blue light of dawn, Ranakorn woke alone in his small house. It was a morning like many others, except for one crucial difference. Something inside him was restless, unfocused, and unresolved. Unable to sit still, he climbed onto his motorbike and rode aimlessly through the winding coastal roads. At some point, perhaps out of habit or instinct, he found himself near the Temple Trail, a popular spot for both locals and tourists seeking scenic views and a moment of quiet reflection. It was there, at the base of the hill, that he first caught sight of Miriam. She was preparing for her hike, bottle of water in hand, backpack slung casually over one shoulder. There was nothing unusual about her presence. She looked like any other traveler enjoying the island's natural beauty. But something about her struck him. Perhaps her composure, her solitude, or the mere fact that she was alone. In an effort to create what he might have perceived as a reason to approach her, Ranakorn entered a nearby flower stall and purchased a small bouquet of marigolds. To a stranger, it might have looked like a simple act of kindness. But the gesture wasn't entirely innocent. It was calculated, designed to invite interaction. Miriam, walking slowly up the trail, heard footsteps behind her. As she turned slightly, Ranakorn approached, flowers in hand. He attempted to speak with her. His words were polite at first, but there was something about the situation that made Miriam cautious. She accepted the flowers with a tentative smile, thanked him, and continued walking. She did not stop. She did not engage beyond basic courtesy. She was firm in her boundaries, something anyone might do in such a situation. But for reasons that would later be explored during intense police questioning, Ronicorn did not let her go. He continued to follow her up the path. What transpired next was not captured on video. The dense foliage, the elevation, and the remote nature of the trail offered no surveillance coverage beyond the initial steps. But what occurred along that stretch of stone and soil would change lives forever. When authorities finally located Ronicorn, it was not through a dramatic confrontation or high-speed chase. In the hours following the discovery on the hillside, he had returned to his home quietly. He had washed his clothes, though some faint discoloration remained. He had placed the flowers on his table. Then he lay on his couch and turned on the television, seemingly trying to immerse himself in something familiar. Those who later reviewed this moment said it was as if he believed that by resuming ordinary routines, the weight of what had happened might somehow disappear. But the moment of reckoning came swiftly. When the police knocked on his door, he did not resist. He opened it slowly, eyes tired, expression unreadable. There was no outburst, no denial. It was as if he had already accepted that this chapter of his life, however private or confusing it had once been, had come to an end. At the station, Ronicorn initially tried to deflect questions. He gave partial answers and inconsistent timelines, but the pressure mounted. The evidence was solid, and the officers questioning him had years of experience reading subtle emotional cues. Eventually, something broke. His demeanor shifted, and he began to speak more openly. Over the next few hours, Ronicorn confessed. His tone was low, his words often faltering, but he walked investigators through the events as he remembered them. He described seeing Miriam, the impulse to follow, and the interaction on the trail. He described a confrontation, one that started with confusion and ended with irreversible consequences. For the investigators listening, even the most hardened among them, there was a quiet unease. The story, though presented calmly, hinted at a disconnect from empathy, a psychological gap that they would later ask forensic specialists to evaluate. But the investigation was not yet complete. A confession, while valuable, was not enough. Authorities needed to verify the details. To fully understand the sequence of events and rule out any inconsistencies, they initiated a formal reenactment. This is standard procedure in many complex cases, especially when visualizing the flow of actions can clarify questions that verbal descriptions alone cannot answer. Ronicorn was escorted back to the temple trail by officers. To shield him from public exposure, his head was covered and the area was temporarily restricted. Step by step, he retraced his actions from that morning. Officers followed closely, observing his movements and comparing them to the evidence they had gathered. The reenactment that took place on Sichang Island was one of the final steps in an investigation that had shaken the region and echoed far beyond Thailand's borders. As authorities observed Ronicorn Romruan retrace his actions step by step, what had once been just a collection of statements, footage, and fragments of testimony began to take on chilling clarity. This was no longer just a case on paper. It became a vivid, undeniable reality. Each movement he made during the reconstruction provided further insight into what happened on that ill-fated trail, the isolated stretch of nature that had turned into the setting of a tragedy. When the reenactment ended, officers and legal officials reviewing the footage confirmed what they had already feared. They now had a complete and deeply disturbing picture of the sequence of events that took place on April 7th. Though the reenactment was handled with care and conducted behind closed barriers to shield the process from the public, word of its emotional weight and the grim nature of the details spread quickly through both local and international media channels. As the formal trial of Ronicorn Romruan commenced, the courtroom became more than just a legal venue. It became a symbol of the search for justice, not only for Miriam Baelte and her family, but also for a community still struggling to reconcile how something so horrifying could happen in a place so peaceful. The case drew global attention. Miriam, a young and vibrant woman from Germany, had come to Thailand as so many do, to experience its beauty, serenity, and hospitality. What happened to her was not just tragic, it struck at the heart of that very image. The trial proceedings were extensively covered by journalists from around the world. Daily updates were broadcast across news outlets, and photos from the courtroom appeared on front pages and social media feeds across multiple continents. For many, it was unthinkable. A promising life ended so suddenly, with no apparent reason beyond the actions of one individual. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented its case with methodical precision. The evidence against Ronicorn was substantial and damning. Surveillance footage captured Miriam beginning her walk to the temple. The flower vendor testified with clarity, recounting how the man had returned alone, looking unsettled and offering a vague excuse about slipping on the trail. These details, combined with his confession, painted a sequence that left little room for doubt. Despite the strength of the case, tension in the courtroom was palpable. Ronicorn's confession, while detailed, lacked the element many had hoped for: remorse. He spoke calmly during his interviews, not offering an apology to Miriam's loved ones, nor expressing regret. That cold demeanor made the atmosphere in the courtroom feel even heavier. It wasn't only about what had happened. It was about the emotional void left in its wake. Yet one of the most unexpected and poignant moments came not from the accused, but from his mother. Her sudden appearance in the courtroom surprised many. She had remained silent during the investigation, unknown to most. Now, standing before the judge and the families in attendance, she addressed the court with a trembling voice that was both sorrowful and sincere. She did not come to defend her son. On the contrary, she spoke with a tone of heartbreak, trying to come to terms with how someone she had raised could cause such harm. She revealed that their relationship had deteriorated in recent years, and that her son had distanced himself, growing more isolated and unpredictable over time. She apologized deeply to Miriam's family, offering not excuses, but a plea for understanding, a search for meaning in a situation where there was none to be found. Her message was simple, yet powerful. Even she believed that justice must be served. Her words, "My son has lost himself, and now he must face what he's done," left a lasting impression on everyone in the courtroom. Ronicorn himself remained silent throughout much of the trial. He did not respond to his mother's emotional speech. His attorneys attempted to present a psychological profile, suggesting that he may have suffered from untreated mental health issues, though this argument never gained traction with the court. The focus remained on the facts of the case and the irreversible consequences of his actions. The judicial process moved quickly, a reflection of the overwhelming evidence and the intensity of public interest. Just 3 months after Miriam's disappearance, the court delivered its verdict. The ruling was swift and uncompromising. Ronicorn Romruan was found guilty and sentenced to capital punishment. Appeals for leniency were submitted by his legal team, but they were denied. The court cited the gravity of the crime, the calculated nature of his actions, and his apparent lack of remorse as key factors in their decision. The reaction was immediate. Outside the courthouse, there was a quiet but powerful expression of solidarity. Mourners gathered holding candles, while others placed flowers in remembrance of Miriam. Though far from her home country, she had become a symbol of innocence lost, and of a community's refusal to let tragedy define them. Back on Sichang Island, the emotional weight of the case continued to linger. What was once a serene destination, known for its gentle waves, small temples, and warm smiles, now carried the burden of a memory too painful to forget. The local community, deeply connected to the identity of their island, worked hard to reclaim the peace they once knew. In the weeks following the trial, residents organized vigils and memorial services in Miriam's honor. At the base of the temple trail, visitors and locals alike created a small memorial. Candles, letters, hand-picked flowers, and quiet prayers marked the place where her journey came to an end. It was a space for reflection, for grief, and for the reaffirmation of a shared commitment to peace. On April 29, 2018, a fisherman noticed something strange floating near the shoreline of the Lane Cove River in Sydney, Australia. Concerned by what he saw, he immediately contacted the authorities. When emergency responders arrived on the scene, they made a tragic discovery that would spark a heartbreaking criminal investigation. Initially, the authorities had no idea who she was. Soon, they linked the unidentified woman to a missing person. Later that same day, Cecilia's family was contacted by police and asked to assist in identifying. Sadly, their worst fears were confirmed. It was indeed Cecilia. Cecilia Bruna Haddad came into the world during the warm and colorful autumn of 1979 in the dynamic city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. From an early age, Cecilia demonstrated exceptional intelligence, maturity, and an unwavering determination that set her apart from her peers. After completing her secondary education with top marks, Cecilia was accepted into the prestigious Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, one of Brazil's most respected and competitive private institutions. She chose to study business and economics, fields that matched her analytical mind and strong organizational skills. Upon graduating with distinction, Cecilia immediately began applying for jobs at major companies. It wasn't long before she was invited to interview at one of the country's leading mining firms, an industry known for its complexity and high standards. The interview process was rigorous, but Cecilia's impressive credentials and confident demeanor left a strong impression. She was offered a position almost immediately, marking the beginning of what would become a rapidly ascending career. Within just a year of joining the company, Cecilia had already climbed the corporate ladder. Her superiors recognized her strategic thinking, professionalism, and ability to handle pressure with grace. At the age of 27, with a bright future ahead of her, she made a bold decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She accepted an offer to work overseas in Australia. The opportunity promised professional growth, financial independence, and new experiences. Although the decision meant leaving behind her family, friends, and familiar surroundings, Cecilia welcomed the challenge with open arms. Relocating to Australia was no small feat. It involved adjusting to a different culture, building new relationships, and learning to navigate a professional landscape that was both exciting and unfamiliar. Cecilia accepted a managerial role at one of the largest mining companies in the country. She not only thrived in her new role, but also built a wide network of professional contacts. By 2016, having spent nearly a decade advancing her career in Australia, Cecilia took another ambitious step. She founded her own consulting company, an entrepreneurial venture designed to provide mentorship and guidance to those looking to start or expand their businesses. Her firm specialized in helping newcomers, particularly immigrants, navigate the complex Australian market. Her initiative quickly gained traction, and her reputation as a knowledgeable and empathetic advisor continued to grow. During this time, Cecilia also prioritized her family. She made it a personal mission to help her younger brother and sister join her in Australia. With her support, they were able to secure employment and begin building their own lives abroad. Professionally, Cecilia was flourishing. She had earned a second degree, expanded her network, and frequently traveled for business and leisure. Her social media reflected a life filled with accomplishments and memorable moments. However, her personal life remained more complicated. Despite her many achievements, romantic stability eluded her. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and continued to believe that a meaningful and lasting relationship was still within reach. In the mid-2000s, during her early years in Sydney, Cecilia entered into a romantic relationship with a co-worker. Their bond quickly deepened, and in time, they decided to marry. For a while, things seemed promising. However, the marriage lasted less than 3 years. Though their relationship ended, it did so amicably. The pair parted ways without bitterness or legal disputes, choosing instead to maintain a cordial and respectful friendship. In 2016, shortly after her divorce, and as her consulting business was gaining momentum, Cecilia decided to return to Brazil for a brief visit. Her return was marked by joy and celebration. Those close to her were delighted to see how much she had achieved. On the third day of her stay, something unexpected happened. Cecilia ran into Mario, a former boyfriend she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Their breakup years earlier had been amicable, but their lives had taken very different paths. While Cecilia had built a successful life abroad, Mario had remained in Brazil, facing various financial and personal setbacks. The encounter stirred up a mix of emotions. In the days that followed, the two rekindled their friendship, reminiscing about old times and visiting familiar places from their past. The connection between them seemed to reignite naturally. After returning to Australia, Cecilia and Mario continued to communicate daily through messages, calls, and video chats. The emotional bond deepened quickly. Within a month, Cecilia had arranged for Mario to come to Sydney, believing that their reunion was a second chance at happiness. Upon his arrival, Mario moved into Cecilia's spacious apartment, located in an upscale part of the city. At first, things seemed hopeful. Cecilia provided for him financially, helping him adjust to his new life. She went so far as to use her business network to help him find a well-paying job. Ever supportive, she encouraged his career development and took great pride in watching him begin to find his footing in a new country. However, as time passed, the relationship began to shift. Mario, once grateful and cooperative, started expressing dissatisfaction with his job and developed an interest in Cecilia's business. He increasingly wanted to be involved in her work, despite lacking the necessary experience. Tensions began to rise as he questioned her decisions and asked for a share in the company. Their arguments became more frequent and emotionally taxing. Cecilia, always diplomatic, tried her best to de-escalate the situation, but the pressure continued to mount. Mario began exhibiting controlling behavior, such as taking her phone without asking and accessing her work laptop. He started to isolate her from close friends and coworkers, making it difficult for her to maintain a healthy support system. Despite her efforts to maintain peace, Cecilia found herself emotionally exhausted. She had invested so much in helping Mario, yet the relationship no longer brought her happiness or stability. After nearly a year of trying to salvage the partnership, she came to a difficult but necessary decision. She sat down with Mario for a calm and honest conversation, explaining that she could no longer continue the relationship under the current circumstances. This final conversation proved to be a turning point, though not in the way anyone had hoped. When Cecilia calmly told Mario that their relationship was over and that she no longer wished to have any contact with him, his reaction was intense and deeply unsettling. Rather than accepting her decision with maturity or respect, Mario erupted in a storm of emotions. The news of their separation wasn't just painful for him, it shattered a fantasy he had refused to let go of. This was the last straw in a long series of emotional highs and lows between them. Cecilia, having reached her emotional limit, asked him to leave her home immediately. It was not a dramatic moment filled with raised voices or emotional pleas, just a firm and resolute decision from a woman determined to take back control of her life. At first, Mario appeared shaken. He tried to plead with her, repeatedly sending heartfelt messages full of apologies, declarations of love, and promises to change. But Cecilia stood her ground. She had come to understand, after many months of emotional distress, that words were no longer enough. Realizing that the situation wasn't going to unfold the way he had hoped, Mario shifted his approach. His once romantic messages gradually turned into manipulative ones, messages laced with guilt, subtle pressure, and eventually, overt threats. Soon after, his behavior escalated from verbal intimidation to something far more troubling: persistent stalking. Cecilia began to notice his presence in places he had no reason to be: outside her office, near her apartment, and even at locations she visited only occasionally. The situation came to a head one night in January 2018. It was late, and Cecilia had just returned home from a long day of work when she heard a knock at the door. To her shock, it was Mario. She hesitated, initially refusing to open the door, but he continued knocking insistently. His voice, though low, carried a tone that made her uneasy. Eventually, without her consent, he forced his way inside. His actions were erratic and frightening. Inside the apartment, the situation grew even more alarming. An argument quickly escalated, and Mario's behavior became unpredictable. Despite being physically smaller and emotionally drained, Cecilia's instincts kicked in. She managed to escape his immediate reach and locked herself in another room, using whatever she could to barricade the door. From behind the door, she begged him to calm down, to think rationally, to leave and never come back. It was only when she threatened to involve law enforcement that he finally relented and left the apartment. In the aftermath, Cecilia was shaken. But despite the severity of the incident, she chose not to report it to the authorities. Perhaps she hoped that it had been a one-time outburst. Perhaps she feared the consequences of escalating the situation further. Or maybe, on some level, she still believed that Mario could find peace and move on. Instead of pressing charges, she decided it was safer to leave her apartment temporarily. For a while, she lived with her sister Carol, and later stayed with her longtime friend Rita. Both women were alarmed by what Cecilia told them. They encouraged her, pleaded with her even, to go to the police and file a formal report. But Cecilia, despite her inner turmoil, continued to hold back. She expressed concern about the consequences for Mario and the stigma that might follow. In her mind, she was protecting him as much as she was trying to protect herself. After about a month of living away, Cecilia returned to her apartment in early April 2018. Though she had tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy, what she discovered upon returning unsettled her all over again. Small signs indicated that Mario had been in the apartment during her absence. The The most disturbing realization came when she discovered that Mario still had a spare key. Neighbors later confirmed Cecilia's suspicions. Several residents had seen Mario loitering around the building, sometimes even standing near her apartment floor. When neighbors gently urged Cecilia to notify the authorities, she declined once again, insisting that she could manage things on her own. She believed, or perhaps hoped, that he would eventually tire and move on. For the next 2 weeks, Cecilia lived in a heightened state of anxiety. She avoided turning on lights at night, kept her movements quiet, and tried to appear as though she wasn't home. On the rare occasions she left the apartment, she did so cautiously, watching carefully for any sign of Mario. If she sensed even the slightest risk, she would stay with her sister or a friend instead. The psychological stress was overwhelming. Cecilia, once a confident and assertive woman, now lived in fear of the person she had once trusted most. Then, just as suddenly as things had spiraled, they seemed to settle. On April 25, 2018, Mario called Cecilia. His tone was calm, almost unusually so. He told her he had thought everything over and had come to terms with their separation. He apologized sincerely and said he understood that they needed to move on. He then mentioned that he had purchased a ticket to fly back to Rio de Janeiro and would be leaving early in the morning on April 28th. Before ending the call, he asked to see her one final time. He said he wanted a proper goodbye, one that would give both of them closure. Cecilia was hesitant but eventually agreed, on the condition that the meeting take place at the airport. She immediately called her sister Carol to relay the details of the conversation. Carol, sensing something wasn't right, urged her not to go. But Cecilia was firm in her decision. She told Carol that she needed to see Mario one last time to ensure he was truly leaving. The two sisters talked at length, with Carol making one final plea for her to reconsider. Cecilia reassured her, saying everything would be fine and promising to call as soon as Mario boarded the plane. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday, April 28th. Cecilia planned to be at Sydney International Airport by 7 a.m. to say her final goodbye before heading to an important business meeting. She was hopeful that this would mark the end of a painful chapter in her life. But the next day, something strange happened. Instead of receiving the promised phone call, Carol received a message from Cecilia, and that was when Carol's unease turned into alarm. In the message, Cecilia claimed that she needed a break from everything that had happened over the past few months. She wrote that she had decided to go to the mountains for a couple of days to clear her head and reflect on her future. She mentioned she wouldn't be reachable for a while, and asked not to be disturbed. It didn't sit right with Carol, or with anyone else who received a similar message. Carol's unease quickly turned to concern when she tried to call her sister back. The call went straight to voicemail. Cecilia's phone had already been turned off. Still, Carol tried to convince herself it might be nothing, that perhaps Cecilia really had needed some space after all the stress she had endured. However, multiple friends, clients, and colleagues began reporting that they too had received the same type of message from Cecilia. Short, vague, and uncharacteristically formal. Even more troubling, she had failed to attend any of her scheduled meetings that day, including a highly anticipated business consultation with potential investors. This was completely unlike her. That evening, after attempting to contact her numerous times without success, Cecilia's loved ones could no longer ignore the sinking feeling. Carol, joined by Rita and a few close friends, went to the police to officially report Cecilia Haddad missing. They brought with them every detail they could provide: her recent movements, the names of people she had been in contact with, and most crucially, the identity of a man who had recently made her life incredibly difficult, Mario Santoro. But by the next morning, that faint hope was devastated when authorities contacted her family with tragic news. Carol was asked to come in to view and identify someone who matched Cecilia's description. On the morning of April 29, 2018, just a day after Cecilia had reportedly planned to meet Mario at the airport, a local man was out fishing on the Lane Cove River. While the spot was usually known for its quiet beauty, that day took a grim turn. The fisherman noticed something unusual floating near the shoreline. Disturbed by what he had found, he immediately contacted the local authorities. Police arrived quickly, and an investigation was launched on the scene. The woman found in the water had no form of identification on her. Her appearance suggested she was in her late 30s, and her clothes were carefully examined for clues. The lack of ID meant the initial priority for investigators was to identify who she was and determine what had led to her tragic fate. Detectives reviewed missing persons reports and found one that stood out. 38-year-old Cecilia Haddad, who had last been heard from on April 28th, and whose sister and friends had filed a missing persons report the previous evening. Comparing photographs and physical descriptions, the investigators quickly suspected the woman recovered from the river was Cecilia. Later that day, her family was brought in, and the worst was confirmed. Carol identified her sister. Detectives immediately launched a full-scale investigation. Their focus turned quickly to Mario Santoro, the ex-boyfriend who had been causing Cecilia distress for several months. The evidence began to mount quickly. Although Mario did not own a car of his own, he used Cecilia's vehicle. Investigators examined her car and discovered various fingerprints and signs that it had recently been used. Phone data became another critical point in the case. By tracing cell tower pings, police were able to map Mario's movements on the day Cecilia disappeared. The data revealed an unusual route, far from the typical path one would take to the airport. Additionally, traffic cameras showed Mario in several locations that lined up with the timeline of Cecilia's disappearance. A breakthrough came when authorities tracked down a taxi driver who had driven Mario to the airport. The driver recalled the ride clearly, not because Mario behaved erratically, but because of a strange request. The passenger had asked for an unexpected detour across a small bridge spanning a quiet portion of the river. Once there, he exited the vehicle briefly, walked over to the edge, and was seen tossing a bag into the water. He also appeared to throw a smaller object, possibly keys, before returning to the taxi and continuing to the airport. The driver retraced the route with the police and brought them to the exact spot where the items had been discarded. Dive teams were immediately deployed to search the riverbed in that area. Fortunately, the water current was weak and visibility was decent. Within hours, the search team made a significant discovery: a large handbag submerged under the water, which contained Cecilia's mobile phone, her work laptop, personal documents, a wallet, and various items that confirmed the bag belonged to her. Not long afterward, the divers also recovered a set of house keys, believed to be the same ones Mario had retained without permission. Back at the command center, the full picture of what had happened was becoming disturbingly clear. Mario, after his final conversation with Cecilia, had never intended to board a flight out of Sydney as a simple farewell. Instead, it now appeared that his intentions were far more sinister. By the time Cecilia's body had been recovered, Mario was already thousands of miles away, having landed in Rio de Janeiro the day after the incident. He likely believed that by fleeing the country, he could escape scrutiny and avoid legal consequences. But the evidence collected by Australian authorities left no room for doubt. The digital footprints, forensic discoveries, and witness testimony formed a powerful case. With everything compiled, law enforcement contacted Interpol and formally issued a request for international assistance. Mario Santoro was now officially wanted for questioning in connection with a serious case. After nearly 2 months of investigation, coordination between agencies, and legal preparations, Brazilian law enforcement finally located Mario on July 7, 2018. He was found staying in a friend's apartment, where he had kept a low profile, seemingly trying to avoid detection. He did not resist arrest and immediately asked for a lawyer. In initial interviews, Mario denied all involvement, presenting himself as a victim of circumstance. But the volume and weight of evidence told a different story. Witnesses testified to his controlling behavior. Messages and call logs demonstrated a pattern of harassment. The physical evidence placed him at the scene. And the contents recovered from the river left no doubt that he had gone to great lengths to erase his presence. Eventually, under the pressure of overwhelming facts and the emotional weight of the testimonies, Mario's story began to crumble. While he never provided a full confession, his shifting narratives and evasive statements did little to convince anyone of his innocence. According to the results of the extensive and meticulous investigation carried out by law enforcement, it became clear that by the time Mario Santoro booked his international flight, he had already formed a grim plan concerning his former partner, Cecilia Haddad. In the early hours of Saturday, April 28, 2018, at approximately 5:30 a.m., Mario arrived at Cecilia's apartment complex in the Sydney suburb where she lived. According to digital records, he rang the building's intercom, attempting to gain entry. Cecilia, expecting to meet him later that morning at the airport, as they had discussed on the phone, was caught completely off guard by his sudden appearance. Given their recent history and the unease she felt around him, she hesitated, She didn't immediately open the door, likely unsettled by this unplanned visit. However, what Cecilia did not know was that Mario had retained a duplicate set of keys to her building, keys she had believed were returned long ago. Using this spare key, he quietly let himself inside without causing a disturbance. Surveillance footage confirmed that no alarm was raised, and neighbors later reported hearing no suspicious sounds that morning, suggesting the encounter may have initially appeared calm, at least on the surface. It is believed that once Mario reached her apartment, he persuaded Cecilia to let him in, possibly under the pretense of wanting to talk before his flight. There was no sign of forced entry, and none of the neighbors reported any shouting or commotion, which further supported the theory that Cecilia may have opened the door voluntarily, still hoping the situation could be resolved peacefully. Unfortunately, that wasn't Mario's true intention. Investigators concluded that once inside, Mario carried out the next stage of his plan with disturbing precision. Rather than leaving for the airport, he instead drove Cecilia's vehicle toward a secluded area along the Lane Cove River, a quiet location not frequently visited during the early morning hours. There, he left her in a place he hoped would delay discovery, giving him a greater chance to flee the country without suspicion. But Mario's actions didn't stop there. After returning to Cecilia's apartment, he began to carefully erase traces of what had happened. He entered her home, took several of her personal items including her laptop, official documents, wallet, and mobile phone, and sent carefully crafted messages from her device. The texts were sent to her sister, close friends, and a few colleagues, all stating that she had made a spontaneous decision to retreat to the mountains for a few days to reflect and recharge. With that done, Mario placed her phone, along with the other items, into a bag. He later took this bag with him when he hailed a taxi to the airport. During the ride, Mario asked the taxi driver to make an unusual detour. He requested that they drive over a small, out-of-the-way bridge, far from the main roads and bustling airport routes. When they reached the quiet crossing, Mario briefly exited the vehicle, walked to the edge, and dropped the bag into the river. He also tossed in another object, believed to be the house keys he had used earlier. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to the taxi, completed the ride to the airport, and boarded his flight to Rio de Janeiro, calm and composed. From the outside, it appeared that Mario had executed a plan with clinical precision. By the time local authorities discovered Cecilia's body and pieced together the first stages of the investigation, Mario was already safely on another continent. Given that he was a Brazilian national and had returned to his home country, this posed a significant legal complication. Nevertheless, the gravity of the case, combined with the mounting evidence, prompted swift international cooperation. Australian authorities worked closely with Brazilian officials and legal experts to ensure that the case could be brought to justice, even if it meant conducting the proceedings in Mario's home country. Legal teams from both nations coordinated over the following months and years to ensure a fair but firm trial, despite the geographic challenges. After years of preparation, hearings, and evidence gathering, Mario Santoro's case finally went to trial in Brazil. The proceedings took into account all of the forensic and digital evidence collected by the Australian police, as well as the extensive witness statements provided by Cecilia's family, friends, and former colleagues. Testimonies painted a clear picture of a relationship that had turned tense, one where control and fear had steadily replaced love and respect. On July 1, 2023, more than 5 years after Cecilia's untimely passing, the verdict was announced. The Brazilian court found Mario Santoro guilty of premeditated murder, as well as multiple related offenses, including tampering with evidence, obstructing justice, and attempting to mislead investigators. His actions were deemed calculated, manipulative, and deeply harmful, both to the victim and to the broader community who had been affected by the crime. Mario was sentenced to 27 years in prison with no possibility of parole. It was about 10:23 a.m. when a local police officer was making his routine rounds when he came across something unusual at an old fishing spot near the shore of the lake. As he approached, he was confronted with a chilling scene: a young woman. The atmosphere was heavy, and the reality of the tragedy quickly began to sink in. The woman was soon identified as 21-year-old Alexandria Madison Costiel, a senior at the University of Mississippi. Alexandria Madison Costiel, affectionately known to her loved ones as High School Ellie, entered the world on September 11, 1997, bringing light and joy to the lives of her parents, Cindy and Keith Costiel. Raised in the heart of St. Louis, Missouri, Ellie shared her childhood with her younger brother, Andrew, and the two formed a bond that was as close as any siblings could hope to have. From a very early age, Ellie stood out, not just because of her radiant smile or warm personality, but because of the positivity she seemed to carry in every fiber of her being. She wasn't just cheerful, she embodied joy. Her laughter could fill a room, and her enthusiasm for life was both genuine and contagious. From elementary school onward, Ellie excelled in nearly everything she attempted. Her academic talents were matched only by her prowess in athletics. Whether on the soccer field, basketball court, or in the classroom, Ellie always pushed herself to achieve more, not for recognition, but because she believed in doing things wholeheartedly. Teachers frequently described her as a natural leader, someone who encouraged others with kindness and led by example rather than authority. She formed close friendships wherever she went, often being the glue that held her social circles together. But Ellie's impact didn't stop within her own community. Even as a teenager, she demonstrated a rare commitment to humanitarian causes. During high school, she took part in volunteer programs that brought her as far as Peru and several parts of Africa, where she dedicated her time to teaching young children the fundamentals of the English language. These were not fleeting missions or superficial trips. Ellie immersed herself fully in the culture, building relationships, learning local customs, and doing her best to leave behind a legacy of kindness and education. Many of those who met her during these trips recalled her patience, her empathy, and her sincere desire to help others succeed. Upon graduating from high school, Ellie made the decision to attend the University of Mississippi, commonly known as Ole Miss, located in Oxford. While some saw this choice as driven by academics alone, for Ellie, the decision held deeper significance. She was drawn not just to the university's academic reputation, particularly its business and marketing programs, but also to its spirited culture, traditions, and rich history. The southern charm of the campus, the revered football culture, and the sense of community all resonated deeply with her. She admired the professors, appreciated the vibrant social life, and was excited to take part in Greek life. Ellie had always been a romantic at heart. Part of her excitement about attending Ole Miss stemmed from her love for Southern culture and her dream of finding someone who would truly understand her heart. Having had only light-hearted crushes in high school, none of which blossomed into serious relationships, Ellie had long hoped that college might bring her that special connection. She envisioned a future filled with love, laughter, and shared dreams, a happy marriage, a warm home, and children she could raise with the same love she had received from her own parents. During her freshman year, Ellie met a fellow student named Brandon Theld, a charismatic young man from Fort Worth, Texas. From their very first meeting, Ellie was captivated. Brandon had a confidence about him that drew people in, and Ellie was no exception. They began spending a lot of time together, attending parties, sharing long conversations, and appearing side by side at numerous sorority events. Ellie invited him to many of her group gatherings, proudly introducing him to her circle. However, while Ellie saw their connection as meaningful, perhaps even the beginning of something lasting, Brandon seemed to see things differently. Although some referred to them as a couple, their relationship never had the clarity or consistency Ellie hoped for. Brandon would sometimes ignore her for extended periods, even blocking her number, only to reappear weeks later with vague explanations and emotional reassurances. He often claimed he wasn't good enough for her, a line that left Ellie both confused and hopeful, as though his absence stemmed from humility rather than detachment. As time passed, it became clear that Brandon had a pattern. He was emotionally distant, inconsistent, and manipulative in subtle ways. While Ellie yearned for love and connection, Brandon seemed to view the relationship more casually, sometimes exploiting her feelings without reciprocating them in a meaningful way. This imbalance caused Ellie emotional distress. Her mood would swing between moments of joy when they were together, to periods of sadness when he withdrew. She never introduced Brandon to her family, and though she had always been close to her mother, she began to withhold the details of this particular relationship. Cindy, her mother, sensed something was troubling Ellie, but chose to be supportive, waiting for her daughter to open up in her own time. By the summer of 2019, Ellie was preparing to enter her senior year of college. Now, 21 years old, she chose to remain on campus for the summer, focusing on classes and extracurricular activities. She seemed determined to make her final year her best one yet. That July, her parents paid her a visit, and their reunion was full of warmth and affection. Ellie was overjoyed to spend time with them, They talked about her future, her plans post-graduation, and the possibility of moving to a new city to pursue a career in marketing. Then came July 19, 2019, a day that seemed at first like any other. That evening, around 7 p.m., Ellie called her parents from her apartment. She had only just woken up after a long nap. Having studied late into the night for an important test, she had decided to rest during the day. That evening, Ellie spoke to her mother on the phone, just as she often did. Their conversation was relaxed, familiar, and carried no signs of urgency or distress. Ellie shared her plans for later that night, telling her mom that she was going to meet up with some of her friends at a local bar in Oxford. It was a routine outing, one she had done countless times before. The tone of the call was upbeat, and by all accounts, Ellie seemed cheerful and at ease. It was just another normal Friday night for a young woman enjoying her college years. There was no indication, none at all, that this would be the last conversation her mother would ever have with her daughter. Hours later, at exactly 11:52 p.m., a security camera located on Oxford Square captured a clear image of Ellie. The footage showed her leaving the bar alone, walking slowly while gazing down at her phone. She appeared calm, focused on her screen as she moved away from the crowd and nightlife. After she walked away from the square, Ellie hailed a cab. The taxi driver later reported that she had been polite, quiet, and gave clear directions to her residence. She was dropped off at home safely a little after midnight. The following morning, July 20th, 2019, began like any other for local law enforcement in Lafayette County. A deputy with the sheriff's office was conducting routine patrols in the Harmontown area, a peaceful wooded region near Lake Sardis, about 30 miles from the University of Mississippi campus. The area was quiet, mostly used by locals for fishing, hiking, and recreation. But on this day, what was supposed to be an uneventful morning quickly turned into a devastating discovery. At approximately 10:23 a.m., the officer noticed something unusual at a remote, abandoned fishing site along the lake. As he approached, he found the woman. It was immediately clear that there was nothing that could be done. The scene was creepy, and the gravity of the situation quickly set in. The young woman was soon identified as 21-year-old Alexandria Madison Costiel, a senior student at Ole Miss. Her purse was found nearby, and inside it was her student ID and driver's license, which helped authorities quickly confirm her identity. The officer notified investigators, and the scene was swiftly secured for a full forensic investigation. As detectives began combing through the area for clues, they made a chilling discovery. 11 spent shell casings were scattered on the ground, not far from where Ellie was found. This evidence made one thing painfully clear. This was not an accident. It was a violent and deliberate act. The investigation moved rapidly. Detectives searched Ellie's apartment in Oxford, looking for any sign of forced entry or struggle, but everything appeared untouched. One important item, however, was missing: her mobile phone. Investigators attempted to ping the phone's GPS, but it only returned a vague signal in Oxford, offering no precise location. Still, this small digital thread became the first break in the case. Fortunately, Ellie had been wearing a smartwatch that was synced to her phone. The smartwatch remained in her apartment and still had recent message data stored. Investigators soon discovered that incoming messages were mirrored on the device, revealing a vital clue. The last person Ellie had texted before her death, and, crucially, the person she had arranged to meet after leaving the bar, was someone she knew well: Brandon Theld, a 22-year-old classmate from her university and the same young man she'd spent months emotionally entangled with. What followed next painted a troubling picture. Although Brandon and Ellie had never officially declared themselves a couple, those closest to Ellie knew that she had strong feelings for him. To Ellie, their relationship might have been undefined but still full of hope. But to Brandon, it seemed Ellie was just a convenience, someone to entertain when it suited him. The emotional imbalance was evident in their messages. When police contacted Brandon and asked him to come in for questioning, he initially agreed. But when the scheduled time arrived, he never showed up. Investigators followed up with a call, and Brandon offered a strange excuse. He claimed he had been drinking the night before and didn't feel it was appropriate to speak with detectives while he was still impaired. So, officers scheduled a new appointment for the following morning. But once again, Brandon failed to appear. This time, it wasn't a miscommunication or a hangover. Brandon had vanished. Detectives now had sufficient reason to believe he was evading law enforcement. A warrant for his arrest was immediately issued, and he was officially declared a fugitive. Police began tracking his known contacts and movements. A description of his vehicle was broadcast to law enforcement agencies across the region. Within hours, the Memphis Police Department's fugitive task force received a tip and located Brandon at a gas station. He was arrested without incident and extradited back to Mississippi, where he was held in custody without bail. From the start, Brandon refused to cooperate, declining to speak until he had an attorney present. On July 23, 2019, Brandon appeared in court for the first time. He was formally charged with the murder of Alexandria Costial. The courtroom was filled with reporters, grieving friends, and community members stunned by the sudden and senseless loss of a young life full of potential. But the question lingered. Why? What could possibly have driven this young man to such a horrifying decision? Investigators believed the answers could be found in the hundreds of text messages exchanged between Brandon and Ellie in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. As they sifted through the conversations, a painful truth began to emerge. Shortly before her death, Ellie had messaged Brandon, telling him she was late, and she suspected she might be pregnant. She had taken a pregnancy test, and the result appeared positive. Brandon's replies were swift and cold. He did not express concern for her well-being or ask questions. Instead, he stated that if she really was pregnant, he wanted her to take care of it immediately. He strongly insisted she not go through with it, saying it would ruin his life. Ellie, in contrast, had sent long, emotional, and heartfelt messages, not out of pressure or drama, but out of confusion, fear, and a desire to understand how the person she cared for could respond with such detachment. She didn't demand anything from him. She wasn't trying to trap him. She was simply reaching out in a moment of vulnerability, likely hoping for compassion. What she received instead was rejection. Investigators now believe that this conversation, particularly her intention to meet him that night to talk in person, had escalated tensions between the two. Faced with an overwhelming and deeply personal crisis, Ellie found herself emotionally cornered, struggling with uncertainty, fear, and an agonizing silence from the very person she thought would support her. She didn't know what to do. The young woman was always close to her family, particularly her mother. But in this moment, perhaps out of fear of disappointing them or adding stress to their lives, she chose to bear the burden alone. She withheld the truth from her parents, trying as best she could to mask the panic that had taken root within her. Instead of leaning on them for comfort, Ellie quietly retreated into herself, battling the emotional storm in isolation. Meanwhile, Brandon's response was not only distant, it was coldly dismissive. Despite receiving message after message from Ellie, expressing confusion, vulnerability, and even fear, he maintained a flat refusal to speak with her in person. He offered no emotional support, no sense of responsibility, and no compassion. Instead, he repeatedly made it clear he did not want to deal with the situation, and especially not the possibility of fatherhood. To those who knew him, Brandon's reaction came as no surprise. His reputation had always carried a certain arrogance. He was often referred to as a daddy's boy, someone who seemed to float through life with the kind of entitlement only deep family wealth could afford. Brandon often bragged, sometimes joking, sometimes not, that his father's money and influence could make anything go away. He believed that consequences were for other people, not for him. But this time, that belief would cost more than just his freedom. It would cost a life. As the investigation deepened, the evidence against Brandon began to mount, substantially and undeniably. There wasn't just circumstantial suspicion. There were physical links that pointed directly to him. Detectives discovered ballistic evidence at the crime scene, 11 spent shell casings that matched a pistol registered to Brandon. More damning still, DNA traces were found on his shirt, later confirmed to be Ellie's. And from Ellie's smartwatch, still synchronized to her phone, investigators retrieved the text messages confirming she had made arrangements to meet Brandon on the night of her death. But the case didn't stop there. Investigators soon uncovered chilling details that painted a much darker picture. This was not a crime of passion. This wasn't a spontaneous act born from an emotional confrontation. Instead, the facts suggested something planned, premeditated, and calculated. 1 week before the tragedy, on Friday, July 12th, Brandon left Oxford and returned to his family home in Fort Worth, Texas. During this trip, he retrieved the pistol later used in the crime. Not only that, but he photographed the weapon and posted it on social media, captioning it with an unsettling message. "Finally bringing my baby back to Oxford." The caption didn't raise flags at the time, but in hindsight, it was a chilling sign of what was to come. As detectives examined Brandon's internet search history, the evidence became even more disturbing. In the days leading up to Ellie's death, Brandon had searched topics such as how to get away with committing a crime, how to plan a murder, tactical face masks, and gun silencers. These weren't idle curiosities or random rabbit holes. They were deliberate, focused queries that pointed to someone preparing for an act. One of the most heartbreaking realizations came when investigators pieced together how Brandon manipulated Ellie into meeting with him. He knew she still hoped for some kind of emotional resolution, especially in light of her pregnancy scare. So, on July 17th, Brandon initiated a conversation for the first time in nearly 3 months. He told her he was ready to talk. He pretended that he finally wanted to acknowledge the pregnancy and discuss what came next. Hopeful and emotionally exhausted, Ellie believed him. Then, in the early morning hours of Thursday, July 18th, around 2 a.m., Ellie sent Brandon a deeply personal message. It included a photo of her abdomen. She was anxious, but also relieved, thinking the moment had finally come when they could have an honest conversation. For Brandon, however, this may have been the trigger that pushed his plan into motion. On the very same day, he began probing further, asking if Ellie's friends would be around when they met. At first, it seemed like a logical concern. It was, after all, a sensitive topic. Ellie, interpreting this as a desire for privacy, reassured him that her friends would not be present. She felt relieved, even grateful, that he was showing interest in talking. But in truth, Brandon was ensuring that no one would witness their meeting or be able to quickly alert authorities if something went wrong. The date was set. On Friday, July 19th, Ellie promised she would leave the bar early to meet him. She didn't want to risk missing the opportunity. That night, after her time out with friends, surveillance footage confirmed her return home. At 1:14 a.m., cameras captured Brandon's vehicle, a distinctive truck with a unique license plate, driving toward Ellie's residence. Just minutes later, another camera recorded the same vehicle heading in the opposite direction, this time with Ellie inside. Their phones, tracked through GPS data, were then traced traveling together through Oxford and toward the remote area near Lake Sardis. Detectives would later learn that Brandon had been drinking heavily the day prior and was seen consuming alcohol again even after arriving at the lakeside location. Witnesses and forensic evidence supported that he brought Ellie to a picnic area by the water. It was here, at this remote site, that they sat down and began discussing the pregnancy. According to the timeline and behavioral analysis, the conversation became tense. Brandon, likely overwhelmed by fear and anger, stepped away from the table. He walked back to his truck, possibly to retrieve the weapon, before returning to where Ellie was sitting. And then, the irreversible happened. No words were recorded from that moment, no last exchange, just the trail of evidence left behind, the shell casings, the heartbreak, and the unanswered question of why a young woman's future had to end that night. In the hours that followed their final interaction near Lake Sardis, both Ellie's and Brandon's phones continued to transmit signals, bouncing off the same cell towers as they moved together. This digital trail, an unspoken witness to their last journey, helped investigators later reconstruct their movements with chilling precision. But not long after the time Ellie was believed to have lost her life, her phone suddenly went dark. The signal disappeared. Authorities suspected Brandon had manually powered down the device and disposed of it, either by tossing it into the lake or destroying it in some other way to hinder future tracking. What came next painted a deeply disturbing portrait of emotional detachment. According to multiple witnesses, Brandon returned to town as though nothing had happened. He joined friends, drank beer, and reportedly showed off his pistol, the same weapon believed to have been used in the crime. His behavior was unsettling, boastful, carefree, and completely void of remorse. There were no outward signs of stress or guilt. He didn't isolate himself, he didn't hide, he partied, he mingled, he laughed. And all the while, Ellie's loved ones had no idea she was already gone. But justice, though sometimes slow, was steadily catching up to him. By August 2019, Brandon's name had made its way into local headlines. What had started as a missing person case had now become a full-scale homicide investigation. The Oxford community, along with the broader University of Mississippi family, was stunned by the details beginning to emerge. The tragedy of Ellie's story, her kindness, her promise, her brutal end, became front-page news, and the alleged perpetrator, a fellow student, someone she trusted, was now the focus of statewide attention. On August 22nd, Brandon appeared in court for a bail hearing. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense, but the hearing took an unexpected turn. Rather than move forward with the request for Brandon's release, his attorney suddenly withdrew the motion. Instead, the defense team made a strategic shift. They asked the judge to order a full psychological evaluation, implying that Brandon's mental health should be considered in evaluating the nature of the crime. It was a common legal tactic. If a defendant could be proven mentally unfit, it might reduce the charges, delay proceedings, or at the very least, complicate the prosecution's path. Brandon's legal team appeared to be laying the groundwork for a future defense based on diminished capacity or emotional instability. The judge, cautious but thorough, approved the evaluation request. However, he also denied Brandon's release, citing the severity of the charges and the risk of flight. Brandon would remain in custody without bail, and the psychological review would proceed in the weeks to follow. As Brandon sat behind bars, prosecutors began building their case with unshakable resolve. They sifted through evidence, digital data, eyewitness testimony, and the contents of Brandon's own devices. His text messages, search history, and travel records all helped paint a clear picture of intent and premeditation. Just 8 days after the bail hearing, on August 30th, 2019, Brandon was back in court, this time to face formal charges. What had initially been classified as a homicide investigation now took a sharper legal form. Brandon was officially charged with the kidnapping and first-degree murder of Alexandria Costial. Both charges were considered capital offenses, and under Mississippi law could be punishable by death. The findings of the court-ordered psychological evaluation were also revealed. Brandon was deemed sane, competent, and fully capable of standing trial. This meant the legal system would proceed accordingly, without accommodations for mental illness. Still, despite the mounting evidence, the ballistic matches, DNA samples, surveillance footage, and manipulated messages, Brandon pleaded not guilty. As 2019 drew to a close, and the calendar turned to 2020, a new complication arose: the global COVID-19 pandemic. The public health crisis brought with it sweeping delays across all sectors, including the judicial system. Court proceedings were postponed, jury selections were put on hold, and Brandon's case, like many others, was pushed further down the calendar. The Costial family waited. Ellie's friends waited. The community waited. More than a year passed. By the time the court system had stabilized and the trial was set to begin, Brandon's strategy shifted again. No longer defiant, no longer pleading innocence, he requested a plea deal. On August 27, 2021, Brandon appeared in court and pleaded guilty to the murder of Alexandria Costial. The decision shocked many who had braced for a lengthy, emotionally grueling trial. But behind closed doors, prosecutors had made a calculated decision. While they had enough evidence to pursue the death penalty, securing such a verdict is rarely straightforward. Death penalty cases require years of litigation, extensive appeals, and airtight evidence that can withstand every level of scrutiny. Instead, state prosecutors agreed to a compromise: a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In doing so, they spared Ellie's family from the torment of a long trial and ensured that Brandon would never walk free again.